Learnin frae the land. My journey began with one word and one poem. Pre-pandemic, I'd attended a workshop at the Ulster Scots agency, facilitated by the wonderful Stuart Patterson. During a lively day of discussions and exercises, Stuart had asked us to contribute Ulster Scots words that we ourselves knew or had heard, and he wrote them up as we volunteered them. In only a few minutes, and accompanied by much warm laughter, as many of us newly recognised or recalled the words offered up by our peers, we gathered what my mother would have called an elegant sufficiency of words. It was the next step that shook something loose within me. Stuart asked us to take some time to refer back to the bank of words before us and to draw some of them into a piece of creative writing. I looked at the collection of words and phrases before me, turned to memories of my life and work on the farm, and I began to write. Sometime later, in 2021, on the longest day of the year to be exact, Hame, the poem I'd begun on that day, was one of the poems I read to my online audience as I launched Walking Off the Land, my debut collection of poetry tracing my childhood life and work here at Rosehill, and my later adult experience of reorienting my relationship with the farm and the land, having lost both my parents by the time I turned 32. Up until 2016, I'd worked as a professional playwright, director and lecturer in theatre for most of my adult life. I'd written and produced historical and contemporary plays and theatre of the absurd. I'd been commissioned to write touring productions for schools that focused on alcohol and drug abuse, and I designed site-specific performances for mental health. I'd spent several years writing and directing highly successful pantomimes that raced their way across genres, and I'd adapted and toured a cluster of novels for the stage. Then I chewed my way off the leash, stepped away from my work and full-time education, and decided to focus on writing and mentoring. But this foray into language was something new. Even the title of this poem showed me that I was returning to the forgotten. Hame. A memory and sound of childhood mornings. My mother shaking out the grisiuchs in the range as light spills into the kitchen like an early guest and day gets underway. I sit at the same old table now and watch the day begin, stirring this memory of language, buried things rise. Dreich winter mornings, keppin base as a wane, scunnered, foundered to the bone, dumping barrel loads of pig shite in the midden, cowping the wheelbarrow at an angle, careful no to get japped with burning specks of dung. Owler now, clabbered to the oxter, weltins thick wi' muck and glaur, hefting a newborn calf across a winter field, it rescued from a shough and drinning in the water. I carry this foundered wee baste, slippery, sterving, and near still heavy in my arms, while its mother, wild wi' fright, loses the heed and gives chase. Wild and wake, head low, guldering frae her throat, skiting and high-stepping through the mud into madness. This living tongue was one I once misplaced. Moving out into the world, I forgot it, laid it by. Now I taste these words again, set them loose upon my tongue, my new remembered voice, my coming home. In writing Hame, I could feel something shift in my writing. This was a familiar voice that had lain quiet and still for much of my adult life. Warily, I began the slow process of reacquainting myself with a language I'd known well and used regularly as I worked with my parents and my sisters on a wee family farm at Rosehill, not too far from Garvagh. So what was it that I learned from the land as a wean? Well, as a farm kid, I learned about nature, animals, the seasons, and the passage of time. From my parents, I came to understand the importance of building a relationship with the space I moved through, setting myself in context. I didn't know it at the time, but decades later, this understanding of my environment and my life would be the foundation on which I would rebuild. I'm the oldest of three. My mother, a teacher, and my father, a farmer, married in their 30s, but my sisters and I didn't make an appearance for almost 10 years. My mother was 43 when I was born, and my dad, 2 years older, was 45. By the time they were 45 and 47, respectively, they had a 2-year-old, a 1-year-old, and a newborn, as well as a live-in mother-in-law, a small herd of milking cows, 2 long byres full of sows and pigs, a collection of diva-like heifers, a coop full of Rhode Island Reds, 2 farm dogs, and a couple of hunting cats who shadowed the byres, only clustering into the light when my father left out a wee bowl of warm, fresh milk for them in the morning and evening. Oh, and an out farm too. Several farmers commiserated with my father that he only had daughters. Later, he'd share this with my mother, telling her he'd immediately responded by saying how happy he was to have daughters who were quicker and handier than any boys. He loved us deeply and taught us so much. I remember learning how to predict incoming seasons by reading the growth of plants and bushes filling the hedgerows around the farm, how to care for animals properly, how to find and identify stars in a winter sky, how to ride a bike, 11th of July 1969, how to drive and maintain a tractor, a Massey 135, oh, be still my beating heart, and how to roll neatly a new sward on a field and to take pride in completing a job well. He'd read us stories when we went to bed, though books weren't his strength as he'd left school at 14. And he drove my mother mad while reducing us girls to giggles with the rattling sound he made from his homemade corncrake. He sang My Grandfather's Clock to us until we knew all the words and gave the softest, whiskeriest kisses when he tucked us in at night. We also learned one of his poems that he'd recite often, I'm Livin' in Drumlister by the Reverend W. F. Marshall. I'm living in Drumlister and I'm getting very old. I have to wear an Indian bag to save me from the cowl. The deal a man in this townland were cleaner reared nor me, but I'm living in Drumlister and clabber to the knee. My memories of my father now lie in quiet places of the farm like mist. The daffodils he planted as a boy in the hedgerows leading to the farm still blossom and nod brightly gold each spring. I have one of the mouth organs that he used to play, as well as his penknife, with the slim, bowed and worn blade that he used every day to cut binder twine, nip briars, or pear hooves. A dog rose that he planted at the front gate leading to the yard a few years before he died still blooms every year, and his beautiful writing remains, a fading echo now, in school books with gentle copper plates so diligently learned, and on the whitewashed wall in the big byre where he noted the herd numbers of cows. On long summer evenings, he'd step up the road to check cattle grazing in the upper fields, and I'd sit patiently on the wall at the front of the farmhouse, watching the small, spry figure walking down the road with his stick, knowing even as I watched him there that someday he wouldn't be there, and I'd have to call on those memories to see him again. On a Sunday, sitting in our uncomfortable church pew with my elasticated beret threatening to creep up my head and fall off, while my small feet swung above the polished floor, I'd snuggle close beside him and hold his hand. My mother was a teacher who adored us, loved her work, and was deeply committed to her primary and secondary school pupils and never wanted to retire. She was a constant learner, picking up prizes for academics achievements in both English and maths in her hires, a late driver, well into her 50s before she nervously sat behind the wheel of a car and drove us kids everywhere. She was a farmer's wife, who began her day around 6:30 a.m. when Dad got up to milk the cows, as she fired up the range, fed pigs, calves, chickens, got us up, dressed and fed us before school, then raced off to teach her own classes. She was a tireless, neat gardener who grew vegetables and filled our garden with roses, fragrant sweet william, lupins, and towering delphiniums. She was a devout and gentle Christian who believed in God but not in racism or sectarianism. An avid reader who shared books and stories with us and inspired us to learn. A wonderful cook with a light pastry hand, who produced rhubarb and blackberry pies and crumbles with the pails of fruit we plundered from the hedgerows as we walked behind trailer loads of hay and then straw. And she was a laughing woman, who often cycled to meet the three of us as we walked the last mile home from primary school, and who had soft, freshly made pancakes layered with butter and sugar melting in the range for us when we came home. My emotional reaction to writing hame with Ulster Scots at its core asked for more attention. As I began to write more seriously and consistently in Ulster Scots, so I began to recognise the energy, strength, and power of these words. They carried the weight of seasons, the nuances of weather and people, the texture of landscape, the routines and rituals of life. They gave shape to grief and loss. These words recalled the people we knew and allowed us to define them by the linguistic idiosyncrasies they possessed. And I began to remember how much a part of my life they had been. My sisters and I knew to settle down and be quiet when an adult told us to mind our wheesht. We'd take a wee juk into the kitchen to see if our mother was about when the smell of the freshly baked and very forbidden soda farrells tempted us down from our rooms. You didn't cut fresh bread. To be foundered was, and still is, a wholly different level of cold when we were clacking wi' cowl, usually as a result of having to very reluctantly keep cattle on a chilly November day when the wind would blow the horns off the cow. A neighbour whose cold had developed into a full-blown lurgy would have explained their absence by saying, I hinny been at myself. And to this day, I can't call a female sheep anything but a yo or a yow. These words captured moments of my life and created colour, texture. They were muscular, expressive, like the soil patiently turned over in endless drills by Heaney's father's spade, or cascading in thick, dark ribbons behind a plough for the planting of the praties each year. These words were a hefty, rich glare, thickened by the weights of consonants and vowels. But how did this change for me? How did it all fall away? It was nothing sudden, that I do know. Simply a gradual leaching away of my Ulster Scots words and phrases as I moved through primary school and beyond, finding myself being constantly chided to talk properly, otherwise I'd be marked as a culchie, which for an 8 or 9-year-old, eager to be accepted either as a superhero in waiting or at least normal, was a badge of shame. Many years later, in Ulster Scots in Northern Ireland, From Neglect to Rebranding, published in Études Irlandaises in 2013, Wesley Hutchinson would explore the notion of neglect of Ulster Scots. The etymology of the word involves the idea of not neck, picking something up, not selecting legere. If Ulster Scots has suffered neglect, the question is, where does the source of this negative choice lie? Is it internal? What makes people decide not to care for, in both the sense of being indifferent to and of not cultivating a given cultural phenomenon? How does that indifference manifest itself? There was another comment from this same very prescient article that I would later look back on and recognise in action. Neglect is structured by the imperial centre and applied to a periphery in an attempt to accelerate the latter's anglicisation. The systematic downgrading of the language and the culture it embodies involves issues of prestige, which encourage users to abandon the language in preference for the langue dominante, the dominant language. I don't know that I ever perceived my gradual change in language as conscious neglect. But as I moved through the education system, I was certainly encouraged to forget. When I wrote stories in class, a ferocious dog wasn't raised, it was angry. A person wasn't carnaptious or crabbit, but cross. If I was describing rainy November days at the farm, I was told to write about walking through mud and not glar. And if I got really messy or grubby during that walk, I was simply that. Messy, grubby, not clabbered to the oxters wi' glaur. If we played too long outdoors at night, my mother would shout on the three of us to come in. No one would gulder at us or gie a right old gowl. And teachers told us not to misbehave in class. We weren't warned to quit acting a gape. For a period of time, as these fell away, I remember missing the weight of familiar words on my tongue. There was a lyrical ease about many of the Ulster Scots words and phrases that left gaps which couldn't be filled. But I could hear some of my classmates sniggering when the occasional slang word slipped out of my mouth, and so I learned to let go. My silence was learned, practiced, acquired. For many years I would step away from a language that I lived and breathed as a Wayne, had listened to, understood, and enjoyed. My helping out around the farm became a necessity when I was 18. On an otherwise unremarkable autumn morning, my mother woke me to say she'd called the doctor as my father had been knocked across the shed by a cow recovering from a calcium deficiency, grass staggers as we would call it, and had been carried into the house. The doctor, not our family doctor at the time, came out to examine my father, who was lying moaning on the couch in the kitchen. He hit him a playful tap on the leg as he left. "Och, we'll send you for an x-ray," he said, "just to make sure. But you'll be fine. You've got nothing more than a bruised hip." It turned out to be a wee bit more serious than that. The impact of landing on the concrete floor had smashed the ball and socket joint completely. My dad would go through one unsuccessful operation trying to pin the shattered bone, and then a much more successful hip replacement operation before he'd be out working again on the farm. My memory of him for a long time afterwards would be his travelling down the road in the morning to feed cattle with a crutch balanced on either side of the Massey 135. From driving the tractor in the hayfield, keeping cattle and bringing out the animals that had broken out, buckraking grass, badly, into the silo and working on the slipe behind the tractor when straw was baled in the autumn. Can I say one thing? Calamine lotion never felt so good at the end of the day. My entire life changed. My two younger sisters were still at school, so with my mother's help, she was teaching in a local secondary school by this time, I took over the running of the farm. I wasn't strong enough to calve cows on my own, so with my dad's agreement, Mum and I sold our herd of suck cows, and I began to buy drop calves in the local market to rear for beef. That first winter, snow fell, and temperatures dropped to -15. I'd grab an early breakfast as dawn broke, and drive down the road to the out farm in the Massey 165 with an icy wind howling through the fluttering canvas at my ankles. Once there at the out farm, I'd cut silage, clean, bed and feed the animals in the sheds, and then return home. After a second breakfast, I'd clean out and lime all the pig pens, balancing a very heavy wooden wheelbarrow across the icy yard to the midden. The pigs would then be given clean bedding and food. With the fall in temperature, several of the new calves in the byres developed viral pneumonia. My father's friend showed me how to set up heat lamps for the animals over each pen. I lagged the old byre windows with hessian sacks filled with straw and administered injections from the vet. More than one night in a row I'd sleep in the kitchen, in the rocking chair beside the range, for I couldn't face going up to a warm bed just to drag myself out of it again a few hours later. We didn't lose one beast. Over 30 years later, with the memory of that bone-deep winter chill, I'd write Brumal, that which happens in the winter, and Winter Ritual, about an old farmer's morning work. Brumal. December empties itself a licht. The morning raises like a pale cowl bird, fingers burn o' the gate o' winter. Winter Ritual. His bony hand, foundered wi' the frost ammonia yarn, breaks the morning ice for the beasts that quietly howl on near han. Their starving breath a frosted cloud of thirst. My dad recovered slowly, but remained fragile, and began, within a few years, to exhibit the slow but inexorable signs of dementia. My mother retired reluctantly from teaching. My sisters and I went off to study at university, one by one. I set aside my Weltons and went off to study English literature as an undergraduate and postgrad. I fell in love with theatre, began writing plays, founded the first of several theatre companies, lectured, researched, married a sailor in the US Navy, as you do, emigrated to California to live and work there. We planned to retire eventually and return to the farm in Northern Ireland. Just over 5 years later, everything changed. I was in LA on the 11th of May 1994, the day my mother died, sitting in a diner, having a late lunch with my then husband, and wondering why a growing unease was roiling in my stomach. We drove back down to our apartment in San Diego, and I ran straight into the living room, heading for the phone, where the answering machine flashed. My mother had been treated for breast cancer the previous year and was still recovering from surgery and intense radiotherapy. I had flown home to be with her during that time and to care for my dad, who was gradually becoming more fragile and confused. During our phone calls after I'd returned to the US, it was clear that Mum was becoming breathless and tired, so when some blood transfusions didn't work, she'd been taken to a nearby hospital for tests to check for possible clots. The clot in her lung, a pulmonary embolism, shifted the day before her results came back. She died instantly. C.S. Lewis, a man attuned to loss, wrote that no one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. Decades later, I would write the briefest of poems about my journey home. Icarus. Shuddering, the plane lifts me to the sky. I dinna know it yet, but like Icarus, I'll burn as I fly. We arrived at the farm at the end of the first day of the wake, a house shadowed and strangely still, with curtains drawn against the generously bright May sunshine. Rooms filled with friends and neighbours balancing cups of tea and conversations in lowered tones. My father sitting quietly, small and pale, in his usual chair beside the range. Less than a year later, he too would be gone. So why all this detail, this autobiography? The title of this talk today I chose for a very specific reason. As everything shifted around me, this learning frae the land became a necessity and a vital tool for recovery. In the early days of my grief, I could not know that these fields, this soil, and this sky would prove a blessing and a balm. I would find, paradoxically, my solace and my inspiration in a timescale of a different kind. Flowers. And when I come back home and I'm pitting in flowers and I know nothing of what I'm doing, but I'm digging deep and pushing seeds into the ground and greeting at the same time, and I ken in my heart as I water the seeds that are gaeing down into the clay, that though I am lost right now, I will recreate life again. And the beauty will be in the colour of the shape of the form of the plants that grow here. I do not need to know what they are called, but it is enough to know that they and I still have the capacity to blossom and to live. Even those plants that have come back unaided are a blessing and a gift. I have become part of another season, a season that is not my own. We form a vital connection when we ground ourselves to the land. We learn the nuances of the seasons, the vagaries of the weather. We step outside the endless rush of our own lives into a rhythm that is larger, deeper, stronger. We don't have to be farmers to understand the wisdom of learning where the sun falls, of understanding how to predict rain. Just watch for the new sickle moon sitting up on her tip. That's when the water will fall. In Memoirs of a Geisha, Arthur Golden writes, "Grief is a most peculiar thing. We're so helpless in the face of it. It's like a window that will simply open of its own accord. The room grows cold, and we can do nothing but shiver. But it opens a little less each time, and a little less. And one day we wonder what has become of it." Grief is the thief of time. A weary afternoon can last a whole season long, while years and memories coalesce into a brief, sharp moment of remembered pain. My return to live at the farm, now empty and silent, brought me to a familiar, much-loved space that had now become shadowed and unknown. I had no one to explore this space with now, to share the history of the fields. At the out farm, one large field was called Texas and another one California, the legacy of an unknown farmer's travels a century before. And I wasn't sure how to manage the land. I would have to learn. And for over 3 decades now, or almost 3 decades, that's exactly what I've done. I've found beauty in each season, and I've fallen in love with light. On winter evenings, when the sky is dark and cold and clear, I'll step out from the scullery, move into the quiet yard, and raise my head to the universe above. I'll walk down the road from the farm on summer mornings and stand by a gate, waiting for the sun. When a hare moves softly from the shadow of a hedge towards the moss, I hold the moment to carry it with me as a secret pleasure through the day. What I have learned frae Learnin is who I was, who I am, and who I might yet be. Grief takes you inside yourself. Life draws you back out again. To pay attention, Mary Oliver says, this is our endless and proper work. Wintertime mornings with a Holy Ghost. Nathan is a better start to the day than to take a wee danner out to the wee seat where I have sat for mair than 20 yearn, and to place a wee gopin of grains for all the wee birds to feed. And when there is a soft blue rise to the morning, and the wee critters flutter and dance around me like flame, I hae my blessing for the day. Paying such attention has drawn me to using Ulster Scots to invoke memory, place, and belonging, to focus on small moments. These moments and these words carry memory in the body and on the tongue. They are the shorthand of the heart. An old farmer remembers love in winter. Oh, for why should I be afeard to be alane this empty winter-time nicht, wi' a cowl moon awa abane me? Whenever I mind the heat of summertime and the quiet touch of their hand o'er mine, it's enough to howl me near hand and warm. To move through a space is to understand it, to spend time with it in careful consideration, and later in memory is also to know it. I travelled the long lane to our out farm for decades, cycled on it as a kid, wobbling on my new second-hand bike as I carried bottles of hot tea in a carefully wrapped piece for the men working in the fields. I walked behind cattle being moved from one field to the next, or going in for the winter. I drove a tractor there on bitter mornings to cut dark, sweet silage, or to spread hay for animals waiting patiently on the icy December soil. My father made bonfires here for my sisters and I, huge, snarling, golden piles of bark and wood that bit the October air, spat gold up into the sky, and seared our small cheeks. This lane turns now into a cobbled path and dips down into a tiny hamlet, once a fading area, now with a growing population once again, and so remains a public right-of-way. I walk it still. My father's rose blooms in the arch at the front of the farm every summer. On quiet evenings, when the heat of the day has drawn out the rich scent of it, I remember him. The rose is called Peace, and with his 3 small daughters raking around the farm, it was the only peace my father had. Well, that was what he told us. Solomon's seal, one of my mother's favourites, blossoms each year by her washing line under the sycamore tree. I remember listening to winter sounds of the farm, the dogs barking and the low mechanical rumblings as my father milked the cows and mixed feeds for the pigs in the steamer house. My mother would shake the coals out of the range before resetting the fire and cooking breakfast. She'd talk to the cat and the dog who waited patiently at the back door as she returned to the house from feeding pigs and then collecting the warm, fresh eggs. Later in the year, I'd slake calamine lotion gratefully onto hot, prickly cuts that I'd garnered from working in both summer and autumn fields, piling fragrant bales of hay and golden straw up to dry. I'd listen to bedtime stories patiently read to us by Mum or Dad, and feel itchy, warm blankets tucked in gently and firmly behind my shoulders as we 3 small girls lay on the edge of sleep. There would be soft kiss on our foreheads in turn as lights were turned out and the bedroom door was left open just a crack so light from the hall could filter in. We were safe, we were sheltered, we were loved. I am lucky beyond measure. This life is an adventure that still delights and entrances me. What I left behind once in my spoken Ulster Scots, I am rediscovering with joy in the written word. Much of my writing in the Ulster Scots tradition evokes memories in times past, but other poems are new, contemporary. Stepping out, as Steve Doran explains in an article written in the Honest Ulsterman earlier this year, to try the boundaries of Ulster Scots and to show its potential. And as he reminds us, Ulster Scots evokes memories, personal, communal, and ancestral. It evokes the hinterland between the oral and the literary. But this is a language that is living and breathing still. I'd like to finish by returning to Wesley Hutchinson's article I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Wesley quotes Sean O'Phelan, who in 1916 to 1941 Tradition and Creation, published in the Bell in 1941, wrote the following: "Traditions can die. They die not for being interfered with, but for not being interfered with. Tradition is like the soil that needs turning over, compost, change of crops. It has to be manhandled, shaken up, and sometimes given a rest. It is not those who question ritual who kill it. They get to know it better and add to it by that knowledge, and add to it even while they rebel against it. But those who examine nothing and question nothing end by knowing nothing and creating nothing. Let us examine. Let us learn. And let us write. All life is breath. To understand these years that weigh upon us, we need to ken the morning air. Nae mere that fierce short sich o' winter that draws cowl air frae the maw o' the darkest day, nor the soft, sweet touch of springtime, wechty wi' the gathering scent o' living things. No een the gold wecht o' licht at the back end of the year when all life's movements slow. No, it's that early morning mist howling the first endless breath of summer, thon fresh bricht light that burns off quick, but in them first sweet minutes wraps us in endless peace, hope, and joy.